So talk to me about how sometimes you were even the intimacy coordinator in some of the scenes. Like we saw you.
That shouldn't be happening, by the way. I just want to be clear that you should not be the intimacy coordinator. You should definitely hire intimidators, which we did have. Thank goodness.
You were teaching Justin how to pull you in.
Where have you seen that?
I actually just saw it too. It was on Instagram yesterday, I think. Yeah.
I think that, romance is really important. You're supposed to, tell a story.
So let's go deeper into this entire situation, because what most people are seeing on the surface is only a small fraction of what is actually happening behind the scenes. And if you really want to understand why this case has shifted so dramatically, you have to stop looking at it like a typical controversy and start looking at it the way the court looked at it, which is through structure, power control, and legal definitions, rather than emotion or public reaction. Because in the beginning, everything about this situation was framed in a way that made it seem very clear who was right and who was wrong, and that's usually how these things go online. People quickly pick a side based on limited clips, selective information, and a narrative that spreads faster than facts. But the moment this entered a courtroom, everything changed. Because now, instead of opinions, you needed proof. Instead of assumptions, you needed legal grounding. And instead of storytelling, you needed consistency. And that is where the cracks in the original narrative began to show. Because the judge didn't start by asking whether something felt wrong. He started by asking whether the law even allowed the claims to exist in the first place. And that single question ended up becoming the most important turning point in the entire case. Because if the foundation isn't valid, then everything built on top of it starts to fall apart. And that's exactly what happened here when the court examined the relationship between the parties involved. It became clear that this was not a traditional employer-employee situation, and that detail might sound minor to someone who is just casually following the story, but legally it is everything, because the laws being used were designed specifically for situations where one person has authority over another, where there is a dependency, where one side controls the environment, the pay, and the conditions, and the other side is expected to follow. But in this case, the dynamic was far more complex, because instead of one side having clear control, there was evidence showing shared influence, and in some areas, even equal or greater control on the part of the person bringing the claims. And once that idea is introduced, it becomes extremely difficult to argue that there was a power imbalance strong enough to support those types of allegations. And the judge didn't just make that conclusion randomly. It was based on documented actions, involvement, and decision-making throughout the production process. Because when you look at the level of participation that was described, it goes far beyond what you would expect from someone who is simply hired to perform a role. We are talking about someone who had input on script changes, who participated in discussions about how scenes should be structured, who had influence over hiring decisions, who communicated directly with multiple departments, and who played a role in shaping not just the performance, but the overall direction of the project. And that kind of involvement suggests partnership rather than subordination, and that distinction is critical, because the entire legal argument depends on the idea that one party was in a vulnerable position under the control of another. And if that idea doesn't hold up, then neither does the argument that follows. And that is why so many of the claims were dismissed, not because the court proved they were false, but because the court determined that even if they were true, they did not meet the legal threshold required under the specific laws being used. And that is a nuance that a lot of people miss, because dismissal is often interpreted as denial, when in reality it can simply mean that the claim was brought under the wrong framework. And that brings us to another important layer of this situation, which is the difference between public perception and legal reality. Because outside the courtroom, people react to how things look and feel, but inside the courtroom, everything has to be defined, categorized, and supported by evidence that fits within established rules. And that is why something that seems obvious online can become complicated or even irrelevant in court. And one of the clearest examples of that is how the court handled the individual incidents that were presented as part of the case. Because instead of treating them as isolated moments, the judge evaluated them within the broader context of filmmaking, and that context changes everything. Because in a creative environment, especially one that involves storytelling through performance, there are elements that would be unusual or even inappropriate in a normal workplace, but are expected as part of the job, and that includes physical interaction, emotional intensity, and even improvisation. And when those elements are removed from their context and presented on their own, they can appear very different from what they actually are, which is why the court emphasized the importance of understanding the setting in which these interactions took place. And when that setting was taken into account, many of the claims that initially seemed strong became much harder to classify as legally actionable, because the actions in question were tied to the roles being performed rather than directed at the individuals themselves. And that distinction again is crucial, because the law is concerned with intent and impact within a specific framework, not just the surface-level appearance of a situation. And that is why scenes involving physical closeness or gestures that might seem questionable in isolation were ultimately viewed as part of a performance rather than evidence of misconduct, especially when there was no indication that they occurred outside the boundaries of the scene or without the presence of others on set. And the same reasoning was applied to discussions about the script and the inclusion of certain types of content, because in a project that deals with mature themes, it is expected that there will be conversations about how those themes are portrayed, and both sides have the opportunity to contribute ideas, accept or reject suggestions, and negotiate the final outcome. And that process, by its nature, involves disagreement and compromise. But disagreement alone does not constitute harassment. And the court made it clear that creative differences, even when they involve sensitive material, do not automatically translate into a hostile environment. And this brings us back to the idea of control. Because one of the strongest indicators that the court relied on was the ability to influence outcomes and make decisions. And when someone has that level of agency, it weakens the argument that they were subjected to conditions they could not change. And that is why the classification as an independent contractor had such a significant impact on the case, because it reframed the entire relationship and shifted the focus away from authority and toward collaboration. And once that shift occurred, the majority of the original claims could no longer be supported under the laws that were initially cited. And that is where we see the case narrowing down to a much smaller set of issues that are still being considered. And those issues are primarily related to retaliation, which operates under a different set of criteria, because even if the original claims do not succeed, there is still the question of whether any actions were taken in response to complaints that could be considered punitive or unfair. And this is an area where the court acknowledged that there is enough disagreement between the parties to warrant further examination, because when one side alleges that there was a coordinated effort to damage their reputation, and the other side denies it completely, the truth cannot be determined without a deeper evaluation of the evidence. And that is why these claims were allowed to move forward, at least for now, because they involve questions of intent, credibility, and interpretation, which are typically resolved by a jury rather than dismissed at an early stage. And what makes this aspect particularly complex is the role of media and public relations. Because in today's digital landscape, narratives can be shaped, amplified, and challenged in ways that were not possible before, and distinguishing between organic reaction and strategic influence is not always straightforward. Which is why the court did not make a definitive ruling on that issue at this point, and instead left it open for further exploration, depending on how the evidence develops. And when you take all of this into account, it becomes clear that what we are seeing now is not the end of the story, but a transformation of it, because the case has moved from a broad set of allegations to a focused dispute over specific actions and their implications. And that shift has important consequences, not only for the individuals involved, but also for how similar situations may be handled in the future, because it highlights the importance of understanding the legal framework before drawing conclusions, and it shows how quickly a narrative can change when it is tested against evidence and defined standards. And that is something that applies far beyond this single case, because in any situation where public opinion forms quickly, there is always a risk that the full picture is not being considered. And that is why moments like this are so important, because they remind us that there is often more going on beneath the surface than what we initially see. And as this situation continues to develop, the focus will remain on the remaining claims, and whether they can be substantiated in a way that meets the legal requirements necessary to move forward. And that process will ultimately determine how this story ends. But regardless of the outcome, one thing is already clear, which is that the narrative has shifted in a way that very few people expected. And that shift is the result of a detailed examination of facts, roles, and responsibilities, rather than assumptions or appearances. And that is what makes this case so interesting to follow. because it is not just about what happened, but about how what happened is interpreted, understood, and judged within a system that operates very differently from the court of public opinion. And that difference is what continues to shape the direction of everything that comes next. As we move further into this situation, what becomes even more important to understand is how perception can be shaped so quickly in the public eye, compared to how slowly and carefully things are evaluated in a legal setting. Because while people online are reacting in real time, forming opinions within seconds, and spreading those opinions across platforms, the court is doing the exact opposite. It is slowing everything down, breaking every claim into parts, examining each piece of evidence and asking whether it fits within a very specific legal definition. And that difference in pace and process is exactly why the outcome we are seeing now feels so different from what many expected in the beginning, because when the story first started gaining attention, it was driven by emotion, by reaction, by clips that were shared without full context, and by narratives that were repeated so often, they started to feel like established facts. But inside the courtroom, none of that matters. What matters is what can be proven, what can be supported, and what actually...
And as we move further into this situation, what becomes even more important to understand is how perception can be shaped so quickly in the public eye, compared to how slowly and carefully things are evaluated in a legal setting. Because while people online are reacting in real time, forming opinions within seconds, and spreading those opinions across platforms, the court is doing the exact opposite. It is slowing everything down, breaking every claim into parts, examining each piece of evidence and asking whether it fits within a very specific legal definition. And that difference in pace and process is exactly why the outcome we are seeing now feels so different from what many expected in the beginning. Because when the story first started gaining attention, it was driven by emotion, by reaction, by clips that were shared without full context, and by narratives that were repeated so often, they started to feel like established facts. But inside the courtroom, none of that matters. What matters is what can be proven, what can be supported, and what actually meets the criteria required under the law. And this is where we begin to see how certain moments that seemed powerful in the public narrative became much less significant when placed under legal scrutiny, because the court is not asking whether something looked uncomfortable. It is asking whether it meets the threshold of being unlawful, and that is a much higher bar than most people realize. And one of the reasons for that is because the law is designed to protect against clear violations, not subjective interpretations of behavior. And that is why intent, context, and consistency all play such a major role in how these situations are judged. Because without those elements, it becomes very difficult to distinguish between something that is genuinely inappropriate and something that is simply being perceived that way after the fact. And this is particularly relevant when we talk about environments like film sets, where the line between professional and performative behavior can often blur, because actors are required to step into roles that involve emotions, actions, and interactions that they would not normally engage in outside of that context. And when those actions are viewed without the framework of the script, the direction, and the creative intent behind them, they can appear very different from what they actually are, which is why the court placed so much emphasis on understanding not just what happened, but where it happened, how it happened, and why it happened. And when all of those factors were considered together, many of the claims that initially seemed straightforward became far more complex, and in some cases insufficient to support a legal argument. And this brings us to another critical element of the case, which is the role of communication both on and off the set, because a significant portion of the narrative was built around how certain interactions were interpreted, and how those interpretations were later presented as part of a larger pattern. But in order for that pattern to hold up legally, it has to be consistent. It has to be supported by multiple sources, and it has to demonstrate a clear connection between the behavior and the alleged harm. And that is where things began to break down. Because while there were individual moments that could be questioned, the overall pattern required to establish a claim was not clearly defined in a way that met the legal standard, and that is why the court was able to separate those moments from the broader allegations and evaluate them on their own merits, rather than accepting them as part of a single narrative. And this approach is important because it prevents isolated incidents from being combined in a way that exaggerates their impact without sufficient evidence to support that conclusion. And it also ensures that each claim is judged based on its own facts rather than its association with other claims. And that level of precision is something that is often missing from public discussions, where everything tends to be grouped together and interpreted as part of a larger story regardless of whether the details actually align. And this difference in approach is one of the key reasons why the outcome in court can differ so dramatically from the outcome in public opinion. Because the court is not influenced by how many times something has been repeated or how strongly people feel about it. It is influenced by whether the claim can stand on its own under the law, and when we look at the remaining aspects of the case, this distinction becomes even more important, because the focus has now shifted away from the original allegations and toward the question of retaliation, which operates under a different set of rules and requires a different type of evidence, because in order to prove retaliation, it is not enough to show that a complaint was made. You also have to show that there was a direct response to that complaint that negatively impacted the person who made it. And that response must be connected in a way that suggests it was motivated by the complaint itself rather than by other factors. And this is where the discussion around media coverage and public perception becomes highly relevant. Because if it can be shown that certain actions were taken specifically to influence how someone was viewed in response to their claims, then that could potentially support an argument for retaliation. But proving that is extremely challenging because it requires clear evidence of intent, coordination, and impact. And those are not easy things to establish, especially in an environment where multiple parties are involved and where information is constantly being shared and reshaped across different platforms. And this is why the court did not make a final determination on this issue at this stage and instead allowed it to move forward for further examination because there are still questions that need to be answered, and those questions cannot be resolved without a more detailed analysis of the evidence and possibly testimony from those involved. And this is where the case enters a new phase, because instead of focusing on what happened during the production, it now focuses on what happened after concerns were raised, and whether those actions were appropriate or crossed a line. And this shift in focus also changes the strategy for both sides, because the arguments that were relevant earlier may no longer apply in the same way, and new evidence, new perspectives, and new interpretations may come into play. And this is why cases like this can evolve so dramatically over time, because as one set of claims is dismissed, another set may take its place, depending on what the remaining facts support. And that evolution is something that often goes unnoticed by the public. Because by the time the narrative has been established, people tend to hold on to their initial impressions even as new information becomes available. And that can create a disconnect between what people believe is happening and what is actually being argued in court. And that disconnect is very evident in this situation, where the majority of the original claims have been dismissed. Yet the conversation online may still reflect the earlier version of the story. And this highlights the importance of staying updated with the actual developments rather than relying solely on initial reports or viral content. Because in complex cases like this, the details matter, and those details can change the entire direction of the outcome. And as we continue to follow this case, it will be important to pay attention not just to what is being said, but to how it is being supported. Because at this stage, everything comes down to evidence, credibility, and interpretation. And those are the factors that will ultimately determine whether the remaining claims can move forward or whether they too will be dismissed. And until that process is complete, there will always be a level of uncertainty, because without a final ruling, we are left with competing narratives, each supported by its own set of arguments, and each attempting to frame the situation in a way that aligns with its position. And that is the nature of legal disputes, especially those that play out in the public eye, because they exist at the intersection of law, media, and perception. And navigating that intersection requires a careful balance between understanding the facts respecting the process and recognizing the limitations of what we can know at any given moment. And that is what makes this case not just a legal matter, but also a reflection of how information is consumed, interpreted, and debated in the modern world, where stories can spread instantly, but the truth often takes much longer to establish. And as this continues to unfold, the gap between those two timelines will likely remain one of the most defining aspects of the entire situation.